Carolina.
I thank the Speaker, and I'm grateful that the Chairman and lead sponsor will, I anticipate, to lend his support to this amendment. It will close a loophole that would defeat the purpose of the bill. In fact, absent this amendment, the bill would inadvertently validate the very conduct this bill aims to stop. Emerging evidence, most notably the Twitter files, depicts what one expert has termed the largest censorship program in U.S. government history. On the pretext of protecting election infrastructure or enforcing the Foreign Agents Registration Act, personnel of the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, the Department of Homeland Security, DHS, the FBI, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, the CIA, the Global Engagement Center of the State Department, which most Americans had never heard of, and even the CDC practically embedded themselves with operators of social media platforms and corporate media to manage and curate Americans' public discourse, to induce Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, etc., to take down lawful and First Amendment protected speech of Americans time and again and again. In so doing, these omnipresent federal agencies established working relationships with a small cadre of supposed internet research groups affiliated in some cases with well-known universities and NGOs, but loaded with political partisans, who purported to create black box analytical efforts to identify social media accounts that amplified content from Russia. But these purported experts, like Hamilton 68, didn't identify Russian amplifying bot networks as they claimed through some sophisticated algorithm. They just found a bunch of American Trump supporter accounts and labeled them that. And for months and months, as they became a trusted source for media that cited Hamilton 68, Twitter, quote, trust and safety executives like Yoel Roth stood quietly by, knowing that Hamilton 68 was a fraud. And guess what? Follow the money. Part of the working relationship between the agencies and the research groups was funding that flowed by the millions in government grants. And each day it becomes clearer that between these three pillars, federal security agencies, media operators, and internet analysts, a new Washington revolving door has emerged to facilitate the same people moving between them and profiting from the scam. The base text of this bill would allow exactly this process to continue. But there is never a legitimate law enforcement purpose for federal agents to take down speech that the First Amendment protects. We've now seen agencies of the federal government once again targeting Americans for their political views. In the government's attempt to stop Russian misinformation, they've targeted and attacked Americans for simply voicing opinions that they disfavor. Their actions violate our First Amendment principles, and Congress must take this action to stop it. The amendment will address the flaw in the bill, but it is odd to me that Democrats who used to so revere the First Amendment are no longer concerned about it. You know, in Lamont versus Postmaster General in 1965, which Democrats lauded, the court held that Americans have a right to receive communist propaganda from abroad. The Democrats loved it then. Now they don't even want Americans to be able to post their views on social media. How abhorrent. But we will fix it. This bill will fix it, and the amendment will fix the bill. And with that, I reserve.
The gentleman reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman from New York seek recognition?
I rise in opposition to the amendment at the desk.
The gentleman is recognized.
My esteemed colleague from North Carolina says that this bill, that lawful speech on the internet should never be prohibited by federal agencies, by the government. We agree. We agree. It's called the First Amendment. It has existed long before H.R. 140 was written. But what H.R. 140 does, and what this amendment does even further, is it makes it impossible for unlawful speech to actually be policed. Because what the private companies do not have is access to the intelligence agency information, national security information, law enforcement information that can determine whether or not the speech that is on the internet is being used in furtherance of crimes or is in and of itself a crime. They recognize this because there is an exception. There is an exception to this prohibition on the law enforcement agencies or federal government agencies from actually communicating with social media. There is an exception for child pornography, for human trafficking, for drug trafficking. And I gather this amendment also deals with obscenity, but it's, I think, trying to close this loophole. Clearly, there's a recognition that law enforcement needs to coordinate to some degree with our social media sites. But what this law does is that, but for those very narrow categories, law enforcement has to wait 72 hours. 72 hours. Everything is around the internet and over again many, many times within 72 hours. It is an exception that eats the rule. There is no way that law enforcement can do its job because of this bill. Now, one would say if you were correct and if there were actual prohibition and censorship of lawful speech that was going on, and if you could show us evidence of that, then maybe one could imagine that a congressional bill was warranted and necessary. But of course, we have none of that. All we have are allegations without any facts or evidence. We have people who have clearly not read the Twitter files talking about the Twitter files. And what we don't even hear about is all of the evidence that Twitter algorithms actually promoted conservative voices more than they promoted Democratic voices. So if this amendment, as I understand it, restricts law enforcement's ability to coordinate with social media sites to protect the public, prosecute crimes, investigate crimes, protect our national security, and protect our infrastructure, then we and I oppose this amendment because it makes a bad bill even worse. And I yield back.
Does the gentleman yield back? Gentleman yield? The gentleman reserves. Gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the chairman, the gentleman from Kentucky.
The gentleman has 30 seconds remaining. Gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I rise in support of the amendment. The Protecting Speech from Government Interference Act prohibits federal employees from censoring lawful speech while ensuring that the government can still protect American citizens and enforce the law. It does this by narrowly exempting lawful actions to exercise legitimate law enforcement functions from the prohibition on censorship. These are lawful actions to suppress unlawful speech, such as child pornography, the illegal transportation of controlled substances, or preventing the unlawful dissemination of properly classified national security information. My colleague's amendment further clarifies the initial intent of this exemption while preserving the bill's reporting requirement to provide Congress timely reports on lawful actions taken by agencies under this exemption. I thank my colleague for his engagement on this important issue, and I yield back.
The gentleman's time is expired.